Hello, and in this section of the video we'll be looking at the second part of the Germany unit, looking at the impact of the Great Depression. So in the first video we looked at Germany from 1890 during the Kaiser's rule through to the impact of the First World War, and carrying on looking at the Weimar democracy, so the challenges it faced between 1919 to 1923, and then that golden period from 1924 through to 1929. And today's is where we begin by looking at the problems Germany faced in 1929 and the impact of the Great Depression. So we'll get straight to it and we'll jump ahead in our revision guide. So what was the impact of the Great Depression? So it helps if we start off by saying what the Great Depression was. So remember, from 1924 onwards, using the Dawes Plan, Germany had borrowed lots of money from America. In 1929, the American economy crashed. There was the Wall Street crash, banks began to collapse, businesses collapsed, millions of people lost their job, and there was a huge decline in global trade. As Germany had borrowed lots of money from American banks called that money back. So they said to Germany, give us our money back, which meant that the German economy also collapsed. So what was this impact? We'll break it into three different factors: economic, social, and political. So first, looking at the economic, Americans brought many goods from Germany, such as cars, electrical equipment, and clothing. They can't afford to buy these anymore, which means German factories have to shut down. If factories have to shut down, lots of people lose their jobs. And as we've said, troubled US banks have to call money back from Germany, meaning that German banks begin to collapse. In terms of political impacts, people had listened to different extreme political parties. So we've got on the left communists and on the right we've got Nazis. These extreme parties are offering radical solutions to Germany's problems, which people probably wouldn't have listened to during the early period when it seemed like the government was doing a good job of things. In the 1930 election, the Communists increased their number of seats from 70 up to 77 from 54, and the Nazis increased from having 12 seats in 1928 to having 107 in 1930. So we can see people are moving away from the centre parties to the extremes as the number of unemployed people starts to grow. And in terms of a social impact, many people are living on the streets, they're jobless, hungry, and they're angry at their leaders who they blame for their problems. So why do we see Nazi growth in particular? In the 4 years, the Nazi parties went from being the 8th most popular in Germany to being the most popular. So we can see here in terms of the unemployment growing. So we can see unemployment was at 6 million and the Nazis were promising jobs. So that's one key factor, the fact that the Nazis promised people jobs. What else did they have? The appeal of Hitler. Hitler was very charismatic. He was someone who, when you spoke, people would listen. He was very good at convincing people, and he gave brilliant speeches to audience that really convinced them that they could trust him as a leader. Another reason, people were very angry at the Weimar politicians. Remember that earlier idea of being stabbed in the back? Now that the problems about with the German economy, people are starting to be angry at that again. Due to that, people are turning away from the ordinary German politicians, and to normal people in Germany, the Nazis look like an outside group. They're not part of the established government. They're not part of the existing problem, so they're seen as a new solution. Here are some questions that you can have a go at if you pause the video. And there is a separate exam technique video that you can use where we've looked at this source and you can see how to analyse it there if you need some help with that. Next up, reasons for the growth of the Nazi Party. We're going to start looking at some specific details and we'll start to look at what their policies were, because this is really important for your exam, that you're able to talk about the policies that they introduced. This is a common area where people drop marks by not being specific about how the Nazis offered policies to different groups, so their policies weren't the same for everyone. So The Nazi Party had different sections to it. It wasn't just one group. There were different people with different aims. So it set up recruiting centres all over Germany. So instead of just being one party, there were lots of smaller parties that people could join. They had the SA, who were protecting Hitler. They would try and influence meetings, so they would protect Nazi meetings to make sure other people didn't come in. But they would also go to rival meetings to break them up, particularly to places where there were communists. They would go there to try and stop people joining the Communist Party. Hitler took part in mass parades and rallies to demonstrate Nazi power. There would be lots of flag waving, trying to convince people the Nazis were a popular party that you could join. They set up youth organisations to encourage young people to support the party. So all through the 20s they were doing this. And by the time we get to the 30s, those children are old enough to vote and have grown up supporting the Nazis. The Nazis used new media, so they used radio and cinema to bring their views and ideas to a wider range of people. They started to use newspapers and they printed leaflets. They had Joseph Goebbels, who was one of Hitler's most loyal followers, who was in charge of propaganda, making all of those posters, spreading those Nazi ideas. And a big appeal for the Nazis is this fear of communism. Lots of people anyone who had property or savings or their own business was very worried that the communists would take that away from them, because you could see the communists were getting more popular during this period. As a response, they looked to the Nazis as a solution to that problem. So lots of the middle class and wealthy Germans saw the Nazis as a way to protect themselves from the communists. How and why did different groups vote for the Nazis? So if we look at the farmers, the depression had hit the Weimar government, hit them hard, and the Weimar government did little to help. The Nazis promised higher prices for crops due to saying that they would be self-sufficient and stop importing food from other countries, and they would make farming a more respectable job to hold. Nazi oppositions to communists appealed to farmers because they didn't want their farms taken from them by the communists. Why did women vote for the Nazis? So the Nazis targeted women voters by saying that family life, good morals and self-discipline are important. So it made women who wanted to base their lives around their families very happy, and it would make their husbands behave better as well under a Nazi government. Some people agreed with Hitler's views that that Weimar culture was bad, so lots of people didn't agree with the new fashions and the drinking and the clubs and the music that was in the Weimar period, and they wanted to return to more old-fashioned lifestyle. The middle classes, so people who had small businesses, doctors, bank workers, managers, so well-educated people who were in good, well-paying jobs, feared that law and order might break down. They were worried there'd be chaos in the streets, and they saw the organisation of the Nazi Party as something that would protect them from that, especially with groups like the SA going around providing order in the streets in their uniforms. They were worried that communists might take over and destroy their way of life, and the Nazis promised to deal with whatever problem might arise. So to the middle class, the Nazis were a way of protecting their lifestyle. And to the very wealthy, the Nazi promised strong leadership, which would make Germany powerful again, giving them more business opportunities. He promised to let owners run factories how they wanted, and he was planning on building more weapons, which would have been good for factory owners. If he needs lots of guns, tanks, planes, uniforms, bullets, bombs, factory owners could make a lot of money making those. And again, the threat of communism. If you own a factory, the Nazis were a way of keeping your factory safe, making sure communists wouldn't take it. And finally, the fifth group is the youth. Hitler promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and make the country strong, which appealed to a lot of young people. And young people wanted to be a part of this new growing Germany that they'd seen during the 20s, and Hitler was promising to keep that going, and he promised them jobs. So he said he would build more motorways, build more homes, build more hospitals, and he would rebuild the army, which had been limited by the Treaty of Versailles, giving people access to lots of jobs and a better standard of living if Hitler had got his plans that he promised them. In summary, the economic depression, which began in America in 1929, affected countries all over the world, Germany was one of the most affected due to its reliance on American loans. Unemployment rose from 2.5 million to 4 million by 1930, and by 1932, 6 million were unemployed. That is a key number to remember. Always useful to have in an exam answer. 6 million unemployed by 1932. Millions felt the Weimar government was doing little to deal with the crisis, so they looked to the extreme, so the extreme left with the communists and the Nazis on the extreme right. And a number of factors meant that support for the Nazi Party grew very quickly. Remember, they offered different groups different things, which meant they got lots of support in different ways. There's not just one answer for why they got their support. The Nazis appealed to a wide variety of people, including the unemployed, farmers, business owners, and the middle class. Here are some exam questions you can have a go at if you pause the video. Next up, the failure of Weimar democracy. So how was Hitler able to actually take control and get rid of Weimar democracy? Parties rarely won a majority in the Weimar Republic, and they usually had to form coalition governments, and then a chancellor would be chosen from those parties to rule. Most coalitions were ineffective as the people didn't agree, and the president could use his Article 48 to make himself essentially a dictator, because he could rule through direct decree, so by his word. In September 1930, no party won a majority, so a coalition is formed, which is typical. The Nazis gained 107 seats, making them the largest party by 1930. Brüning of the Centre Party became Chancellor, but he was unpopular because he cut unemployment pay and taxes began to rise. So we can see here the votes. The Nazi Party is second to the SPD, with the Communists being third. So you can see those extreme parties catching up to those more moderate centre parties. What does Hitler do after the 1930 election? So, he runs in the 1932 presidential election. So he's not trying to be Chancellor, he tries to be president at the very top. He puts up millions of posters across Germany. He gets the SA to beat up communists and disrupt their attempts to run in this election. And many Germans felt that the chaos and violence just showed how incapable the Weimar government was of ruling. And in March 1932, Hitler did challenge Hindenburg for the presidency. He got 13.4 million votes, which put him second. He didn't win, because Hindenburg got 19.3 million votes, but it showed that Hitler was popular in Germany to have picked up that 13.4 million votes. Finally, in July 1932, in the elections, the Chancellor resigned. Hindenburg appointed another official from the Centre Party, von Papen. You can see the Centre Party was less popular than the Nazi Party. So 97 seats, and the Nazis were the largest party. So despite being the largest party, the Nazis didn't have a majority and Hitler wasn't made Chancellor yet. What happened with this new Chancellor? As a result of his success, Hitler demanded that Hindenburg made him the Chancellor. Hindenburg refused, so his main reason is he views the Nazis as disruptive. He doesn't trust them to be in power. However, von Papen, who was made Chancellor, called for an election. The Nazis' votes fell slightly. However, they were still the most popular party in Germany. And due to this, von Papen and President Hindenburg came up with a plan. They agreed that Hitler would be made the Chancellor. But first, Hindenburg gave his friend, Kurt von Schleicher, a go at being Chancellor. He had very little support and resigned almost straight away, meaning that by the 30th of January 1933, Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. Again, Hindenburg tried to limit Hitler's power by only giving him 2 other Nazis in the German cabinet, so the cabinet are the key politicians responsible for ruling the country, and that was done to try and limit Hitler's influence in the hope that they could control Hitler and use his popularity to gain support from the government without giving Hitler any real power. And here's an exam question we can have a go at if you pause. So, how did Hitler manage to go from being the elected Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933 to making himself dictator? So, in February 1933, Hitler called for a new election. The election took place in March, and he hoped he'd get a majority now that he had greater influence. So he was able to control newspapers and radio stations. He was able to use the police to intimidate voters. So we can see here, you've got the police at the voting booth, and you've got the radio campaign telling you to vote for Hitler. In February 1933, a week before the voting day on that election, the Reichstag burnt down. So Germany's Houses of Parliament, the place where the politicians meet up and do their voting, Hitler blamed it on a communist plot to take over Germany. This just added to the fear of communists, meaning that more people started to see the Nazis as a solution to fight communism. On the 28th of February, Hitler asked Hindenburg to pass an emergency protection law, which gave Hitler power to deal with Germany's problems. So Hitler got more power, he was able to arrest people, and he used that power to arrest 6,000 communists, so key members of their party, which meant that many people in Germany saw them as criminals, and it also stopped them being able to vote in the elections. In March 1933, a decree for the protection of the people and state was passed. It banned leading communists from taking part in any election campaigns, and thousands of communists were put into jail, and their newspapers were banned so they couldn't spread their ideas. In the election on the 5th of March, Germany's got more votes than ever, but they still didn't have that majority. So they didn't have more than 50% of the votes. And carrying on until the 23rd of March, Centre Party politicians decided that they would join the Nazi Party. That gave Hitler his majority, and many centre politicians were bullied into passing the Enabling Act. What the Enabling Act was, it made it so that Hitler could pass laws without the approval of the Reichstag, making him a dictator because he no longer needed the approval of the elected government to do what he wanted. He could do what he wanted with the only person above him now being President Hindenburg. On the 7th of April 1933, the Nazis were put in charge of all local government and councils. They introduced the Gestapo, which was the secret police, and they opened the first concentration camp to deal with political rivals. They put lots of communists into those. So we've got two forms of control, the Gestapo and concentration camps, introduced in April 1933. On the 2nd of May 1933, Hitler banned all trade unions. That weakened the Communist Party because workers could no longer get together in groups, which were the people that made up the Communist Party. July 1933, Hitler banned all political parties except the Nazis, and he said that you couldn't start any new ones. That meant that Germany was now a one-party state. There was only one party that controlled the government. And finally, August 1934, Hitler murdered his opponents in the SA. So this is the Night of Long Knives. This is where Hitler kills Rom. He brings the SA under his control, so that military wing of the Nazi Party, and by doing this, he made the army loyal to the Nazi Party, to him personally, and they swore an oath to protect him. So he made the army swear an oath of loyalty to him, not the country. So Germany's army was now loyal to him personally. And then later in 1934, Hindenburg died, and Hitler made himself the president as well. So this meant Hitler held the office of both president and chancellor, meaning he controlled all of the important parts of Germany's government, and people were loyal to him personally. There were no longer any threats to his power within the Nazi Party, and there were no longer any threats to him from outside the Nazi Party. Meaning by August 1934, Hitler had total control of Germany, thanks to the Night of the Long Knives and the impact that had on making the army loyal to him. Here is an exam question you can have a go at now that you've got that knowledge. And again, the exam technique for this question is available in the exam technique video. And now, I mentioned the threat of the SA and the Night of Long Knives and we'll go into that in a bit more detail just to give you a greater understanding of what actually happened there. So, the threat of the SA. So remember, the SA was the military wing of the Nazi Party. They were sort of like the street thugs. They'd carry weapons, they'd march in uniform, they'd break up rival meetings, and they'd provide law and order on the streets as long as the Nazi Party agreed with you. So, it went from help to hindrance. So early on, the SA provided protection from Hitler, for Hitler, and it would beat up his rivals. Many SA members were violent thugs who just wanted well-paid jobs, and now they wanted rewards. Their leader was Ernst Röhm. Hitler worried that Röhm was powerful and popular, and he might actually be able to overthrow Hitler as leader of the Nazi Party. And the SA had more members than the German army, so there's more people within the military wing of the Nazi Party than were in the German army. Röhm wanted to combine the SA and the army into one group which he would control, and that really worried Hitler because Hitler was aware that Röhm would be able to challenge him for power. How did Hitler deal with this? He planned the Night of the Long Knives. His plan was to kill Röhm, so he arranged a meeting with all the key SA leaders in June 1934, and he had his members of the SS, so the elite, most loyal Nazis who were trained and truly believed all of the Nazi ideas, went in and they killed the key SA leaders. They arrested Röhm and the leaders. Many were shot and killed because of it. And over the next few days, he rounded up his political opponents and he got rid of them. Why was all of that done? So the impact. It meant that Hitler's rivals were now dead, meaning that Hitler had no internal rival. It meant that the SS was now much more important within the Nazi Party, and it was responsible for Hitler's security, no longer the SA. And he now formed the Gestapo, which is the secret police. What that made very clear to people, Hitler didn't hide that he was willing to use murder as a means of making sure that he remained in control of the Nazi government, and it also let the German army know that they were no longer going to be replaced by the SA, leaving Hitler in a position where he could get the German army to declare their loyalty to him rather than to the German country. As a result of all this, Hitler quickly increased his power and established complete control. He used new media and propaganda and the SA to intimidate voters and beat up opponents because he kept the SA, but now more tightly under his leadership. A number of laws were passed which limited personal freedom, which let Hitler rule without the Reichstag, and the Night of the Long Knives removed any threat that Hitler faced within the Nazi Party. Here is an exam question you can have a go at. So the first part is showing off your knowledge, and the second part is an exam question involving sources. Again, there is an exam technique video that you can have a look at where we look at these two sources. And that is as far as we'll go with this unit. So we've seen from the impact of the Great Depression in 1929 right the way through to the end of 1934, where Hitler has established himself as the unchallenged leader of the Nazi Party, and he's made himself the unchallenged ruler of Germany by eliminating internal threats from within the party and external threats by rounding up his rivals into concentration camps and by gaining the support of the army. And we'll end our lesson there. Any questions or anything like that, make sure to ask. There's also all of the other videos that cover each of the topics that I've quickly gone over in more detail. You can just click on them by looking at their titles for more information.